Welcome to Simply Mrs. Moody, a space where real healing, growth, and faith meet.
Hey, family, and welcome back to Simply Mrs. Moody podcast, the place where we talk honestly about mental health, emotional wellness, relationships, faith, healing, and growth. I'm Sarita Moody, and today we're diving into a question that can completely transform relationships if you're willing to really sit with it. Am I trying to be understood more than I'm trying to understand? Phew. Now, listen, this isn't an easy question because most of us feel genuinely unheard at times. And most of us feel unseen, misunderstood, overlooked, dismissed, corrected, or emotionally disconnected in certain moments, especially in close relationships, especially in intimate relationships. And when emotions get involved, we naturally want someone to hear us, validate us, and understand our heart. But sometimes both people are fighting to be understood at the exact same time, right? And that creates a cycle, a painful one, a cycle where nobody actually feels emotionally safe. I have seen this and witnessed this through so many different mother-daughter relationships, couple relationships, father-son relationships in my therapeutic practice. And this is a conversation that I wanted to have today. We're going to unpack communication and conflict cycles, emotional safety, defensiveness, validation versus explanation. And we're going to talk about the pursue withdrawal dynamic. I'll get more into that. Accountability and how faith can help us grow healthier in our relationships. Well, let's get into it. So first, we want to talk about communication and conflict cycles. One thing that I've learned as a therapist, and honestly, as a wife, a mother, a friend, or just a human being, is that most conflicts is not about the issue. It's about the pattern, the cycle. Maybe one person brings up a concern. The other person immediately feels accused. So they become defensive. Then the first person feels unheard because the focus shifted away from their feelings. So now they escalate emotionally, trying to explain themselves harder. The other person gets overwhelmed and shuts down. Now, one feels abandoned emotionally while the other feels attacked emotionally. And around and around and around we go. Not because either person necessarily has bad intentions, but because both nervous systems are reacting. And sometimes people are not fighting each other. They're fighting the feelings of not being emotionally safe. And when we don't recognize the cycle, we become committed to proving our point instead of protecting the connection. So as we talk about that, one of the things that is really important when we talk about communication and protecting connections or the lack thereof, we go into feeling unheard and misunderstood. And let's be honest, feeling misunderstood can hurt deeply. It really can. I'm a victim of that as well. But I've also been a person that has been the person not seeking to understand, if that makes sense. So especially when it's someone that you love. We don't do it intentionally. Well, maybe we do. I guess you have to soul search yourself, but I don't do it intentionally or haven't done it intentionally. Um, you can start thinking they don't hear me, they don't care, they keep missing my point. Why do I always have to explain myself? Why do I feel emotionally alone, even in this relationship? And when those feelings build up over time, emotional escalation happens. Now, we don't always, emotional escalation doesn't always happen, but um, someone is trying to create drama, is what we think. But is that your rational side thinking, or is it the irrational side thinking? We'll get more into that. But because they're trying to desperately feel seen, sometimes anger is actually hurt that lost patience. Listen to that. When you're trying to be heard and you're not feeling like you're being heard, sometimes anger is actually hurt that has lost patience. Sometimes correction is fear. Sometimes defensiveness is shame or even guilt. Sometimes shutdown is emotional overwhelm. And when I think about the emotional overwhelm piece, that just means that you lack the ability to self-regulate the emotions that come from the guilt or shame, or even the fear, etc. Right? That's why we get defensive. And sometimes the real cry underneath the conflict is, please understand my heart. I remember a conversation I had with my mom recently. Well, not recently, it was sometime last year. And we got upset about something, and I had to use that word. I had to use that word. A lot of times we say, it wasn't my intention. But oftentimes when we say intention, that kind of triggers people, and then they shut down even more. But what I had to tell my mom is, that wasn't my heart. Please understand, that wasn't my heart. And so that got a different response from her, because she actually felt like I understood it, that I wasn't being malicious, basically, right? So I think sometimes wording makes a difference, and we'll talk more about that too. Right now, we're going to go into validation versus explanation. Ooh, let me say it again. Validation versus explanation. This is where many couples, struggle, because people often confuse validation with agreement. But validation is not saying you're right and I'm wrong. Validation says, I can understand why you feel the way you feel. That's different, right? Sometimes a person is trying to explain their intentions, but the timing is wrong. Because when someone is emotionally hurting, explanations can feel like dismissals. For example, I didn't mean it like that. You took it the wrong way. That's not what I was saying. You're misunderstanding me. Now, technically, those statements may even be true, but emotionally, the person may hear your feelings are invalid. And this is why emotional empathy matters before clarification. People calm down faster when they feel understood first, not corrected first. And sometimes your partner doesn't need a courtroom defense. They need emotional reassurance. They need, I can see how that hurt you. I understand why that landed that way. I hear your heart. The clarification can happen more safely. And then we think about how it's being said. Tone and emotional delivery makes a difference too. Can we talk about tone? Listen, because tone actually matters. How it's not what you say all the time. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's how you say it. You can say the right words with the wrong spirit and still create emotional injury. Sometimes it's not what you said, it's how it felt to the person you said it to, especially if it came in waves of sarcasm, dismissiveness, interrupting, not, talking over. Oh, I hate that one. That's one of my pet peeves. Correcting every detail, talking over someone. I just said that. Heavy sighing, like, emotionally checking out. These things communicate something emotionally, even if it's unintentional. And when emotional safety is low, people become hyper aware of tone. I used to say, okay, with that tone, I am not talking anymore. You're going to have to pipe down the tones, bring it down 3 notches, right? So I can hear you. Some people grew up in an environment where criticism, conflict, and emotional unpredictability made them sensitive to delivery, right? So if someone already feels unseen, even a defensive tone can intensify the wound. And let's be honest, sometimes we focus so hard on proving accuracy that we completely miss emotional impact. You can win the argument and still damage the connection. You can win the argument and still damage the connection. When I work with clients, I have to remind them, especially couples, you are not each other's enemy. My wife is not the enemy. My husband is not the enemy. You can win the argument and still damage the connection. So let's talk about the pursue withdraw dynamic. Um, we talk about one of the most common relationship dynamics, the pursue withdraw cycle. One partner pursues connection, conversation, reassurance, clarification. The other withdraws emotionally, shuts down, becomes quiet, avoids, and disengages. Usually the pursuer thinks, why won't you talk to me? And the withdrawer thinks, why won't you stop pressuring me? Neither person feels safe. The other feels overwhelmed. And well, one feels overwhelmed and the other one fears or feels abandoned. And if they don't understand each other's emotional wiring, they start assigning negative motives. I call those negative motives in my head negative Nancy. I told you some before that I have a client that calls the negative thoughts Unquisha and Cruella, whatever the villain is in your head that has you thinking something negative towards your partner or your husband or your wife. But many times the withdrawer is not trying to be cruel. They're flooded emotionally. And many times the pursuer is not trying to attack. They're desperate for emotional connection. Understanding this changes everything because instead of seeing each other as enemies, you start seeing the cycle as the enemy, the cycle, right? So let's talk about emotional safety and clarification. Healthy communication requires emotional safety. And emotional safety is built when people feel heard, respected, reflected accurately, emotionally considered, safe enough to be vulnerable without punishment or judgment. One of the most powerful things you can say during a conflict is, help me understand, not let me tell you why you're wrong, or that's not what happened, right? But help me understand what that felt like for you. Reflection is powerful. When I work with my clients, I always give reflection prompts and questions for homework because no growth is going to happen in any of these areas unless you know how to take the mirror and turn it on yourself. And I've talked about that in some of my other podcasts. Like I said, reflection is powerful. Repeating back what you heard before responding can de-escalate conflict tremendously. And not only can it de-escalate conflict, it can validate, because now I feel like you're listening to me. Now I feel like you heard what I said. Now I can say, yes, that's correct, or no, that's not, and clarify. Things like, so what I hear you say is, this is a common terminology I use in my sessions with my clients. So what I hear you saying is, after they've said whatever their grievances are or whatever they were speaking to you about, or you can say, it sounds like you felt dismissed when, or you can say, you needed reassurance in that moment, didn't you? Right? That creates safety because people relax when they feel emotionally understood. Problem solving works better after connection happens, not before. That's why it's so important to keep the connection solid before you do anything else. So let's talk about self-awareness and accountability. And this is really important. Really, 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 really important in communication. This is the hard part, really. Self-awareness. Because every single one of us contributes something to unhealthy cycles. It's just human nature. Every single one. Maybe you interrupt. Maybe you over-explain. That used to be me. Maybe you shut down. Maybe you become defensive quickly. Maybe you pursue too intensely. Maybe your tone becomes sharp and loud. Maybe you avoid vulnerability. Growth happens when we stop asking who started it and start asking, how am I contributing to this cycle? Accountability is not self-hatred. It's maturity. It's emotional maturity. And healthy relationships require two people willing to look inward, not just outward, not just point the finger, but look inward. Now, faith and relationship growth is a big thing. And as Special Hands Outreach and as Simply Mrs. Moody, I do not make that any secret. So I can't end this episode without bringing faith into the conversation, because relationships are spiritual work too. Scripture reminds us in James 1:19, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Quick to listen, not quick to defend, not quick to explain, not quick to correct, quick to listen. Ephesians 4:29 reminds us to speak in ways that build others up. And Proverbs tells us that gentle answers turn away wrath. Phew. That's hard sometimes, even for me, especially when emotions are high. That healthy love requires humility. It requires patience. It requires grace. And honestly, sometimes it requires pausing long enough to pray before responding. Sometimes the strongest thing that you can say, Lord, help me hear beyond my own hurt. Ooh, that's so big. Lord, help me hear beyond my own hurt. Because when people are committed to understanding each other instead of defeating each other, the relationship becomes safer, healthier, more connected, and more emotionally intimate. So I want to leave you with the question again. Am I trying to be understood more than I'm trying to understand? And listen, this doesn't mean your feelings don't matter. They absolutely do. But relationships grow when both people become curious about each other's emotional experience. not just committed to defending their own. Again, as I always say, take a breath this week before reacting. Slow down, listen deeper, reflect before correcting, validate before explaining, and ask yourself, what does emotional safety look like in the way I can communicate with people I love? Thank you all for tuning in to Simply Mrs. Moody. I so enjoyed this time that we have together. If this episode blessed you, helped you think differently, or gave language to something you've been struggling with, share it with someone you love. And remember, healing, growth, emotional wisdom, and faith can all work together. I love you all, and I will see you next time. Simply Mrs. Moody, I am out.
For support, contact specialhandsoutreach.org at 443-256-5290.